The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
Hey guys, Nicky Joe here. Welcome to Alternative Experience. So, you know the rhyme, beans, they're good for your heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. We all grew up with it. We laughed, we chanted it on the playground. It's just one of those things that every kid knew. Well, recently I started wondering, because I've been going down the rabbit hole with regards to plant protective proteins and plant foods not being as good for us as they should. I've started thinking, what if that rhyme didn't just appear out of nowhere? What if, and please stay with me on this, what if it was part of something bigger? I don't know, something cultural, nutritional, maybe even institutional. Because once I scratched the surface, this silly little chant, it got a whole lot more interesting. So I did what any modern day curious person does. I asked ChatGPT. And the first answer was pretty standard. And actually, I think I did this a while back and just stopped there because it was like, it's folklore. It's part of a long tradition of like school potty humor, you know, mid 20th century schoolyard diffusion. There was no author. There was no deeper meaning. There were no claims to anybody that said they owned it. And it was just put down to kids being kids. But I was like, it may be kids being kids, but who started it? And that's when I came across an anecdotal claim that this exact version, beans, good for your heart, was first coined by a schoolboy in the 1960s in Virginia in a place called, I think it's Montrose. It might be Montrose. I'm going to say Montrose because that's how it's spelt. So apologies if I'm butchering that for anyone that may live there. But I found that was kind of specific. But I put it to one side because it was unverified. And then the rabbit hole deepened. I decided to do a search on any nutritional programs being rolled out at that particular time, and Montrose, Virginia, it popped up. And the reason being is it's the exact place where the USDA's home demonstration program was active at the same time. Now, this was a program specifically designed to teach families how to cook more beans and legumes. Coincidence. But let's rewind a little bit. So historically, beans and legumes were heavily associated with poverty. They were cheap, they were filling, and we knew they made you fart. And in fact, upper class society would mock the poor for their farty diets. You know, flatulence became, I suppose, a kind of social punchline, and it was a marker of the lower classes. But we stopped eating so much and turned over to dairy and meat in the sort of 1800s when we were, I suppose, rearing our own food. And then came World War II. Meat shortages, rationing, resourcefulness. And suddenly the government began promoting beans as a viable, valuable, nutritious, meat-free source of protein. And that didn't stop after the war. Throughout the 50s and the 60s, the USDA and cooperative extension services were actively teaching American families, specifically women, how to cook with legumes. And this was especially the case in rural areas like Montrose. In 1960, there was something called Plan of Work for Westmoreland County, and there was an agent called Sadie Roan, and she outlined education on meat substitutes such as dried beans and peas, nutritious, economical, suitable for family meals. And now you've got kids growing up in households where beans are suddenly everywhere. And obviously their bodies, well, they're reacting the way that bodies do when you suddenly ramp up resistant starches, fiber, and lectins, which are plant protective proteins. This leads to gas, bloating, cramping, cue the rhyme. But this wasn't just local. This was happening on a global scale. There was a legume comeback. In Australia, for example, legumes were added to their dietary guidelines in 1992. And then in 2013, they were promoted into a dual role as both a vegetable and a protein source. Same year, 1992 in the US, the Food Guide Pyramid Group beans with meats and nuts. They were still kind of an afterthought, but by 2005, the dietary guidelines for Americans made it much easier for them to count beans as a full meat substitute. About two-thirds of a cup they claimed would replace the serving of meat. And by 2011, we got the My Plate graphic, which moved beans squarely into the protein group ahead of many meats. And now with the upcoming 2025 guidelines, we are expected not just to be sort of told that they're a protein source, but recommended a minimum of 2.5 cups of pulses per week. So it's now a recommendation that we get these every single week in our diets. Then add in the UN's International Year of Pulses in 2016 and the rise of the so-called leguminati. That is a real thing. They called themselves the leguminati. And there were big brands like Rancho Gordo that were heading this sort of bean revival culture. So I suppose when you put all those things together, you've got a full-blown global legume PR campaign, which is suspicious in itself. Now, this is why all of this matters to me. People will sit there and say, yep, beans were recognized, they were rolled out to help starvation and blah, blah, blah. But the reason this matters to me is I'm trained in gut health. I'm trained in the gut microbiome, the gut-brain connection, and I've coached thousands of people on their gut health and imbalances, but I've also spent years healing from my own chronic digestive issues. And during that time, I started to question many of the blanket health claims around certain foods, specifically vegetables and pulses, etc., because I knew about these plant protective proteins, and especially those that didn't sit well with my own body or my clients' bodies. So beans, yes, they're very high in nutrients, but they're not very bioavailable, and they also contain defensive compounds like lectins, phytates, enzyme inhibitors, oxalates, and they can irritate the gut, they can block absorption of nutrients, and they cause inflammation in people that are sensitive, gas, bloating, indigestion. They're not just quirky side effects. They are signals from your body. It's your body's way of saying something doesn't feel right. You need to pay attention. So now I can't really help but wonder, what if that rhyme, the more you eat, the more you fart, wasn't just funny? What if it was a subtle cultural push, to normalize those symptoms that should have been seen as potential warning signs? Now, I'm not suggesting that the USDA, FDA, any of these companies wrote the song, but there is something very oddly aligned about this whole thing. You've got that top-down push globally to get more people eating more beans and legumes. You've got this known digestive side effect. You've got a social history of fart-based sort of class shame, which we know we don't want to resurface. And then you've got this catchy rhyme that helps kids to laugh off their discomfort and normalize those symptoms. So maybe this was more than just a joke. Maybe it was a cultural metabolizing of public health policy. Maybe it was how a generation of kids learn to live with that discomfort without questioning it by singing out loud, and laughing and joking with their friends. So no, I don't have definitive proof. This is just a thought exercise, but the more I look, the more I find. And when things like that line up, it just gets you thinking. Anyway, thanks for listening. If this stirred something in you, curiosity, questions, maybe even gas, send me a message. I would love to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this little rabbit hole, share it, review it, subscribe to the channel, etc. It really does help us to get noticed by the algorithm. So do that if you can. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, guys. The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.
The Alternative Experience.